Welcome to Contemporary Issues with Dr. Bravkin. Today I'd like to talk about Wagner Group. This is the private military company that just a few days ago, seized Bakhmut. And the title today is Wagner Group, Putin's Private Army. A very interesting topic. So what is a Wagner Group? Sometimes they're called musicians, sometimes they're called a private military company. It definitely has nothing to do with music, and they're not musicians. Wagner Group is called a private military company, but there is no statute in Russian law for a private military company, especially of a size like it is, which actually is the size of several divisions or an army. So the reason that it just became so important is that it showed what it can do, and that is after 8 months of very heavy fighting with tremendous casualties, it did take Bakhmut, a strategically important city in Donbass. So the questions I'd like to ask today is, who are these people, and especially their leader, Evgeniy Prigozhin? Why did they succeed, whereas in other areas Russian army didn't do so well? What is its history, and what is its relation to the regular Russian army and President Putin? So, very briefly, a profile of this military unit. According to some interviews that Prigozhin himself gave recently on Telegram canal, at the height of its performance, it had 55,000 soldiers. What is very interesting about it is its structure. He said that they had no officers, that they consist of soldiers and those in charge of specific units, such as commander of an artillery unit, commander of intelligence unit, commander of a storm unit. It's a very much emphasis is put on no distinctions between rank as it is in a regular army, and more on the teamwork and team coordination. Interestingly enough, Prigozhin himself has absolutely no military training whatsoever. He had never been in a regular army except when he was young as a draftee. And yet he has created a very, very effective military unit. He also said that they had 55,000 soldiers, but at the same time he said they have their own artillery, they have their own intelligence, they have tanks, they have aircraft, they have helicopters, and they, in operational terms, are completely independent of the military establishment in Moscow or the Russian regular army, except that they get their supplies from the Russian general staff, and I talk to that a little bit later, because this is a source of tremendous complaints and quarrels, the issue of military supplies. So Prigozhin calls his army the best army in the world. Well, of course, he certainly likes his own army, but it is effective in a sense that in the Battle of Bakhmut that lasted from September 2022 to May 20th, 2023, it did accomplish its goal, and that is take a fortified city with very heavy fighting, street after street, house after house, and the history of that operation basically is that when the Russians suffered a defeat in August 22, when the Ukrainians pushed over and squeezed the Russian units out of the area around Kharkov, this is when Prigozhin tells us he had a meeting with General Surovikin, and they decided that Wagner Group will be fighting for Bakhmut, and its goal would be to attract on itself and draw the most capable Ukrainian units into the protracted fight in Bakhmut, so that at that time the newly mobilized 300,000 Russian army could be trained, integrated, and prepared for the offensive later in 2023, which should begin pretty soon in the summer this year. So this is exactly what they've decided to do, and the strategy was that they would fight trying to inflict as many casualties as possible, as a kind of a meat grinder, as Prigozhin himself put it. And so according to his figures, which I have no authority to know or not to know, to prove or disprove, but this is what he said in his interview, that he claims that according to his data, 50,000 Ukrainians were destroyed as dead during this fighting, and 35,000 were wounded. So these are very, very heavy casualties, given the fact that that presumably this means that the Ukrainian defending side had 85 to 100,000 defenders, and the Prigozhin group, Wagner group, had only 55,000 soldiers. So with minor forces, they were able to inflict enormous casualties on the Ukrainians, which they partly admit themselves. Now, before I go in the contemporary situation any further, let's look at the history of the Wagner group. So sometimes Prigozhin is referred to as the cook of Putin, and that he used to be his cook, apparently, they say. No, this is not true according to Prigozhin himself. His past is quite strange. In the 1990s, he said he was the owner of a series of top-ranked restaurants and catering service, and at many gala occasions he had a chance to meet very important people, including President Putin. And then comes a very strange interlude as to how a caterer turned into a military commander of a private military company. That transition he didn't explain, but this is what actually happened. And the history of the Wagner group before the Ukrainian war was primarily concerned Africa, where Wagner group appeared as a private military contractor group that did all kinds of things. Sometimes it's accused of terrorism, but it was very, very effective in several countries, in Central African Republic, in Sudan, in Mali, and in many other countries. And the French news, which I regularly watch, showed many interesting pictures of Africans having Russian flags and Putin flags, and they were, trying to burn French flags, etc. So in a sense, they're kind of exploiting the frictions in various African countries and the anti-colonial sentiment. So this is what they were like before the Ukrainian war. And one can also say that the idea probably was generated in the United States. It was a Blackwater private military service or company that was used extensively by the United States in the Iraq war, so that there'll be no reporting to Congress as to how many US soldiers were killed, so that the accounting could be all done on a basis of private contracts that are not a matter of public scrutiny. So it was actually Bush that created the idea of using in international conflicts a private army. And so Putin just followed in this suit. And then it would have remained an obscure page in history if it were not for the Ukrainian war and very interesting and effective use of a Wagner group in Ukraine. So Wagner recruits. Who are these people? There's two parts. A lot of them are from prisons. They are recruited by Prigozhin himself in various prisons, and the reason for that is that he himself served time in early 1990s, apparently for burglary or for some other theft. And in his interview, there are some echoes of this where he says that Robin Hood was his hero. So he kind of presents himself as a modern Robin Hood who robbed, all kinds of thieves. And there were quite many of these oligarchs and people who stole on mass scale in the early 1990s from the state. And then Prigozhin says that private property is sacred. So apparently what he was doing is robbing some bureaucrats or some state officials or whatever. And then I don't know if he was distributing it to the poor. But in any case, this is what he served 8 years and made many, many connections in the prison world. And his language is very, couldn't be called cultured. He uses a lot of obscene words all the time, which is typical for the convicts. In any case, so he goes around prisons and he recruits the convicts there. And the deal is that everybody knows is that if they serve 6 months, they are released and then they get a presidential pardon. And some of them have become heroes, and some of them have great decorations for their military service. Now, the second part are regular contracts. And since he has become so much in the vogue and so much press coverage, there's quite a lot of people who want to serve in the Wagner Group. As a matter of fact, he just admitted that the son of Mr. Peskov, who is the press secretary of President Putin, also served half a year with the Wagner Group. So the relationship between Wagner and Putin, and the relationship between the Wagner Group and Prigozhin and the rest of the army. These are two interesting questions. One thing is sure, that Putin covers them. Putin supports them. And after the takeover of Bakhmut, Putin himself sent a public telegram congratulating them on their victory. At the same time, there are very tense and publicly bad relations between Prigozhin and the Minister of Defense, Shoigu. So much so that it becomes a national scandal. Basically, Prigozhin has always accused him of being jealous of Wagner Group and not giving them enough ammunition as to any other military unit. So by his calculation, the official data exists as to how much the military unit should get in ammunition for such and such a territory, for such and such an engagement, and so on. According to these calculations, Prigozhin says he was getting 10-15% of what they were supposed to get, and the result of higher casualties. And recently, about 2 weeks ago, he published in his Telegram channel, which is like an equivalent of Twitter, a very, very rude appeal, calling him all kinds of nasty names, which I have no way to repeat in public, but they were very obscene and very public insults to Shoigu, accusing him of the deaths of his soldiers by not providing him enough ammunition. So it was very angry, and nothing happened. Shoigu was not in any way reprimanded, but neither was Prigozhin. And when it was over, on the 20th of May, Putin sent a telegram congratulating Prigozhin. So apparently Putin likes Prigozhin and wants to keep him as a kind of a watchdog on his generals, because Prigozhin keeps talking about corruption in the Russian army and specifically accuses of corruption Shoigu. Now, what's also interesting is that he is of a very high opinion of Ukrainian army. He says basically Ukrainian army is one of the best now in the world, and it can fight with various ammunitions and with various tanks and all kinds of machinery, and it's got good intelligence. They're brave. He's very, very high opinion. And at the same time, he criticizes the Russian army. And according to him, the worst problem of the Russian army is bureaucracy and the culture of officers feeling superior and the culture of being afraid to say your opinion and always looking up to what your boss is going to say and how he's going to treat you if he disagrees with you. So all of that, he says, are the weak sides of the Russian army. Now, finally, I want to say that his view of the Ukrainian army is a little bit exaggerated. Ukrainian army is just as corrupt as the Russian army, or more so. I would say much more so, because millions and millions of dollars just disappear when they come in the form of aid. All kinds of ammunition is very easy to cover up that it was lost in battle, and then it reappears on the black markets. And then the civilian aid, where the United States basically is paying for the Ukrainian government and all its employees and all its expenses, and that's also a source of tremendous theft and corruption. The second problem that Prigozhin knows but somehow failed to mention is that Ukrainian army has three categories and three tiers. The very best supplied are the foreign elements, and there are lots of Poles and Germans and Americans and all kinds of others who fight on the side of Ukrainians, and when the Western correspondents cover their performance, I can hear in the publicly published reports, I can hear English, I can hear Polish and German. So these are the well supplied units. And then there are the regular Ukrainian army, which is also advanced elite units such as Azov regiment and so forth. And then comes the so-called territorial defense units. And these are poorly supplied, poorly trained conscripts that are dying like flies, like they're dying by thousands. They're thrown into battle, and they are the ones who are the meat grinder. They are the ones who are suffering all the casualties. And the United States, who is running the show, the military operation in Ukraine, they certainly do not care as to how many conscripts die in this battle. And that accounts, to my extent, not so much the, perhaps also in addition to Wagner Group's performance, but also this kind of a structure of Ukrainian army accounts for tremendous casualties. Now, Russian army it probably does have the issues that Prigozhin referred to, but at the same time, he failed to mention that it now has tremendous training, and Surovikin, his favorite general, is the deputy chair of the headquarters, supreme headquarters, and there's a lot of new equipment that is coming in, and they are going to replace Wagner Group. And finally, the conclusion is that Wagner Group has revealed very interesting new data on the conduct of the war, and that the Russian regular army is not pursuing the same tactics of a meat grinder, of destroying as many Ukrainians as the Wagner Group did, because their strategy has now changed, and that is economic pressure, destroying military infrastructure by high precision missiles, and forcing the Ukraine to either negotiate the end of the war or achieve a Russian military victory, which is different objectives and different methods than Wagner Group. But nevertheless, it is an extremely interesting page in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe.